Things like this usually don't happen in a community like ours. It's very tragic.
Investigators release autopsy reports today for 8 members of an Ohio family killed execution style.
We begin tonight with a deadline that has passed for the mother of 2 missing children from Rexburg.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amanda, and this channel we talk about all things true crime related. Today we're going to be discussing day 3 and maybe day 4 of the Brooks, Houck, and Joseph Lawson trial, and may record an episode of day 4 after this. It just might be easier to split them up separately, to upload them, but we'll see how it flows and see where it goes. Their trial is taking place in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and both men are charged in connection with the disappearance of Crystal Rogers from Bardstown, Kentucky. Brooks, who was Crystal's live-in boyfriend at the time, is charged with her murder and tampering with evidence, while Joseph Lawson is charged with conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with evidence. Not much is publicly known about Joseph Lawson aside from what came out during his father Steve Lawson's trial. Steve went to trial at the end of May and was convicted on the same charges his son is now facing. I'll link day 3 and 4 of Steve's trial in the comments and maybe as I'm in somewhere here, which includes his testimony and his conviction. Before we get into today's covers, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm really working to 1,000 subscribers, and both of those things really help me out. So I want to take a second to thank those reporters that are in the courtroom. There's WSH 11, WLKY, I believe, Wave 3. I'll go ahead and post them here and link them in the description box. They are in there with their handwritten notes every day. I want to make sure that I give them credit because all of this comes from them. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't know any of it. If you'd like to support the channels, there are links also posted below, like buying me a coffee and other ways to help out. Now, we begin with Detective John Snow taking the stand on Thursday, June 26th, and he began by reviewing another interview from Brooks. This one is from July 7th, 2015, with the Kentucky State Police. Snow had observed the interview while it was being conducted, and at one point, Brooks is asked, "What is the worst thing that has ever happened to you?" And he couldn't answer. The following day, Snow said he reviewed the phone records for both Crystal and Brooks, and this is when he noticed a midnight phone call on Brooks's phone. Snow told the jury that up until that point, Brooks never mentioned this phone call. Snow then said he contacted Brooks for another interview, which then was played for the jury. This is the interview that has been publicly released, but apparently, according to those in the courtroom, there's more to it than we've seen. While Brooks was walking into the interview room, he could be seen adjusting something in his pocket, and it appears to be a voice recorder. Detective Snow testified that he wasn't aware of this at the time because Brooks had walked into the room ahead of him, but he became aware of it when he watched the video back. Going back to the interview, Detective Snow asked Brooks, "What were you doing on the farm for 4.5 hours, especially since it was such a rainy day?" He had Brooks write a handwritten statement, which took about an hour and 20 minutes for him to do. While Brooks was writing it, Snow took his phone to review it. Once he was finished, Brooks began reading the statement out loud while Snow observed from another room. The prosecution asked John Snow if this was something that is usually done, and Snow replied no. Brooks's timeline, as it was laid out in his statement, begins with him paying his cell phone bill at 4 p.m., then invoicing lumber at 4:30 p.m., and he was going through bills with his manager. He said he paid Danny Singleton, and then he went back home, but Crystal wasn't there, so he went to the Circle K to fill a tractor with gas, and when he got back, Crystal was at home around 5:30 p.m. Brooks said that he, Kaylee, and E were all home until about 7 p.m. when Kaylee went to her grandmother's and the other 3 went to the Houck family farm. There was really nothing on his timeline between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. According to Brooks, they just parked the car at the end. They got out, walked the farm, fed the cows. Apparently there was a fire, and they left once the rain put out the fire. Brooks offered the detective to use his phone to establish a timeline. In the interview, Brooks would request a copy of a statement saying that he feared that someone else may write on it, so Detective Snow went through the copy that he made to show him that nothing else had been added. The prosecution printed out Brooks' statement and gave it to jurors in binders for them to be able to flip through and review. Snow asked Brooks if there was any relationship issues between him and Crystal. Brooks responded in this interview that they would sometimes fight and Crystal would run off, but he said there were normal issues and they always made up and found their way back to each other. In the interview, Brooks seemed to become frustrated that his answers weren't good enough for Detective Snow. But Detective Snow was seen calming him down and they just began talking about the property. During this, Joseph Lawson can be seen wearing headphones to be listening to the interviews along with the jurors. Brooks Houck was not. After break, testimony with John Snow continues. More video of Brooks' interrogation was shown for the court. Brooks is seen drawing a map on the farm, and Snow asked if they were doing any work on the farm. Brooks just talked about a burn pile and said they had fire control because of the rain. Brooks said that he stayed up with Crystal when they returned home and he went to bed. He said he woke up later than he normally does on July 4th and noticed that Crystal was gone. He said he tried to call her and that he didn't assume the worst, thinking that she could have gone to a fantasy party, saying that sometimes she would go out with her friends these fantasy parties. Snow testified that he did not find any indication that she had been to any fantasy parties before. In the interview that was being played, Snow pointed out in gaps in Brooks' timeline, and Brooks again showed signs of frustration. Snow asked Brooks about the midnight phone call. Brooks would type this phone number into his phone, and it would actually show up as Steve Lawson, someone who had worked for him. Brooks would then call Steve and put it on speakerphone. Brooks started the conversation talking about work, saying that he needed Steve and that his skid steer was broken. Then Brooks asked Steve why he called him around midnight on July 4th. Steve replied that it was about a rental property and that Brooks told him he would need to talk to Crystal. Once Brooks was off the phone with Steven, Snow asked why he would tell Steve that he had to talk to Crystal if she was sitting next to him in the truck. Brooks said Crystal probably wouldn't want to deal with that, or maybe E was asleep, so he just wanted to keep the call brief. Also, during that interview, Brooks' brother Nick called and told him to basically stop talking to police. Snow testified that before Nick made that phone call, he didn't suspect Nick of being involved. But after that phone call, Brooks told Snow, "Just ask me what you have to ask." This shift in Brooks' tone immediately happened after speaking with his brother. Next, the prosecution would play clips of Brooks' interview with Nancy Grace that happened on July 9th, where he would talk to her about the night Crystal disappeared, describing it as nothing special, saying that after they returned home, Crystal played games on her phone while he went to bed. Also learned that on July 9th, Detective Snow invited Nick in for an interview, but Nick declined. Bardstown police brought in Nick's cruiser that day to be processed, and it was searched by the Kentucky State Police. Photos taken by the Kentucky State Police were submitted to be entered into evidence, but the defense objected. The objection was sustained and the prosecution moved on. Surveillance video from a nearby dog park shows Nick following Brooks in his cruiser to the family farm on July 8th after Brooks finished the interview with Detective John Snow. The prosecution asked John Snow why he was so focused on the night of July 3rd into the 4th, and Snow said because there was no proof that Crystal made it home and she has not been seen since. After lunch, the defense began their cross-examination of Detective Snow. Defense attorney Shoring asked if detectives were able to identify Roger's car leaving the crime scene on July 3rd. Snow responded that due to the darkness, they couldn't make out the make and model of the vehicle that was leaving. Then, the defense focused on how cooperative the entire Houck family have been. They pointed out that there was no signs of foul play that were found, and that investigators spent thousands of hours on this case. They interviewed hundreds of people, and they conducted tons of searches on the Houck family property. Snow did testify that there was no physical evidence of a crime scene, a body, or method of death that was found. He also acknowledged that Brooks did cooperate with investigators. He provided many interviews, and he consented to the searches of his home and his truck. Snow said that Rosemary also gave them permission to search the family farm, but they still obtained a search warrant because she was at a medical appointment and not present at the time. Snow admitted, though, that he conducted more searches in this case than any other during his career. Next, the defense attorney provided more context for that July 3rd midnight phone call that we heard about from between Steve Lawson and Brooks. The defense pointed out that Brooks had been contacted earlier by Steve Lawson's stepdaughter's husband, and they had been texting with him about a rental property. Brooks and Steve had maintained that that phone call was just about that rental property, while prosecutors believe that Steve called to tell Brooks that Crystal's vehicle had been moved. Continuing with cross-examination, the defense attorney stated that Steve's stepdaughter had been evicted from one of Brooks's properties, and then he presented text messages showing the woman's husband asking Brooks about looking at a new house. This part was a little confusing, and there are some confusing parts in this because, like I said, there are not allowed cameras in the courtroom, and they can only take handwritten notes, so sometimes it's confusing, and it seems a bit weird that he was in one of Brooks's rental properties and being evicted, and then he asked about another rental property. I don't know anyone who would be evicted from one place that would the same landlord would rent to them in another place. But it was noted that there were no other phone calls between Brooks and Steve Lawson prior to this one. Defense attorney Shoring asked Snow about that July 8th interview and how it was released to the public in October of 2015. Snow testified that the interview had been sent to the Bardstown Police Department and he wasn't sure how it got leaked. Next, the defense attorney argued as a result of this leak that any witness from that point on could have watched the interview, pointing out that that video had over 100,000 views. He also brought up the fact that Snow had been a part of an Oxygen series in 2018. It was like a 6-part Oxygen series where he was interviewed. Shorin had also made a point to highlight Brooks said that Crystal was not at risk of harming herself and that she did not do drugs. And when he was asked in an interview with Detective Snow, he had no idea what may have happened to Crystal. Next, telephone records show that Brooks attempted to contact Crystal by calling her 3 times around 9 a.m. on July 4th, again around noon that same day, and then one more time on July 5th around 6 p.m., with each call going to voicemail. He texted her 1 time as well. Later, Brooks would send text messages to a few of Crystal's family members and friends asking if they had seen or heard from her, and they have not. During that one text message that Brooks sent her in the first 36 hours that she was missing, quote, "Everyone is worried sick. Please call me back," which she never responded to. He sent that text message on Sunday, July 5th. This was presented by the defense, who argued that Brooks was a concerned boyfriend and he didn't have any reason to panic right away, as Crystal was known to leave in the middle of the night during arguments. However, Detective John Snow quickly snapped back. They weren't in a fight that night. The defense responded by saying that they were discussing how Brooks treated E better than Crystal's other kids, and Snow said that Brooks told him it wasn't a fight. Another thread shown in court Thursday was from April 26, about 6 weeks before Crystal had disappeared, with Crystal saying, quote, "I cannot deal with how you treat me anymore. I'm tired of always being on the back burner." With Brooks replying, quote, "Please come home. Running from your problems won't fix them." Continuing under cross-examination, Snow did acknowledge that there was a fingerprint found on Crystal Rogers' cell phone, I believe it was a thumbprint, which did not match anyone in Brooks' family, Joseph Lawson, or Steve Lawson. And there was also a palm print that was found on Crystal's car that did not match anyone that was in their family. Snow went on to testify that it did not appear that the car had been wiped clean when it was left on the Bluegrass Parkway, and he noted that there was hairs found in the car, but they were too fragile to test. The defense went on to bring up the fact that there was a detective who had viewed surveillance video from a food mart near Boston Road, but they never collected the footage. The Commonwealth asked to approach, and after a sidebar, the defense changed their line of questioning. From there, they pointed out that during the interview footage, Brooke was cut off, saying he was going to be a single parent. They argued that the video failed to show that Brooks went on to say he needed them to bring Crystal home safely. Then, Joseph Lawson's attorney got up to question the witness for the first time since this trial started. Kevin Coleman asked Jon Snow, just to clarify, the only time we've heard Joseph Lawson's name so far is to confirm that his DNA was not in the vehicle, and to which Snow replied yes. There were a few jury questions. One asked if the clothing Crystal had been seen wearing in the Walmart video, if it was ever found. Snow said no. Then another question was if Brooks had left any voicemails for Crystal when he attempted to call her those 3 times. And Snow said that investigators do not believe he did. After that, Detective Jon Snow was off the stand, and the Commonwealth will call 7 witnesses that would attempt to poke holes in the statement that Brooks wrote out for police. A woman, Marcella, she testified that she was a former owner of a Radio Shack where Brooks had purchased a voice recorder from. She testified that on July 6, 2015, Brooks and E went into the store and Brooks asked to buy the best voice recorder money could buy. She said that she took a photo of Brooks in the store that day when he was with his son because every time his son went to lift his head, Brooks would tell him to put it down, and it just something made her feel off. She held on to those records and receipts until 2020 when she contacted the FBI. Next to testify was Diane Thompson. She is a Nelson County clerk, and she testified that she did not see Brooks Houck on July 3rd, 2015, even though he wrote on his statement that he was, as the office was actually closed that day due to the holiday. Now, on cross-examination, Brooks, the defense attorney, pointed out that during his timeline, he didn't explicitly lay out that he was going to file eviction notices, but rather he needed to gather addresses for possible eviction notices. Following her was a man named Steven, who does vinyl siding work and has worked with Brooks in the past, not to be confused with Stephen Lawson, different Steven. This Steve was on Brooks' timelines, having done work with him on that day, July 3rd, but Steve testified that that did not happen because it was raining that day, so he didn't work with Brooks. Up next was Peggy P., who said that she worked for the Salt River Electric Company and had dealt with Brooks in the past. He came in to file work orders and pick up meters. In his timeline, Brooks actually referred to her as Peggy Smith, but she testified she was the only Peggy that works there. Brooks claimed that he was gathering addresses to give to Peggy for work orders, but the defense pointed out that during his timeline, again, he didn't lay out explicitly that he went to see her that day, only that he was gathering addresses. James Palmer, a former president of the HOA for Woodland Springs, where Brooks owned some houses, he testified that properties in the community that Brooks owned were in violation, specifically for not cutting the grass. And on July 3rd, those properties were inspected, and Brooks was cited for multiple violations. The lawns were out of compliance, and the HOA had to send mowers to actually take care of them, and I guess later billed Brooks for the work. This contradicted his own timeline, where he claimed that he had mowed lawns that day. Following his testimony was that of Richie Rigg, a neighbor and coworker of both Crystal and Brooks, testified. He said that Crystal had left him a voicemail asking for help removing a renter's belongings from a house. Rigg told her that he would meet her that coming Monday. Crystal's sister Brooke would later come to his house to ask if he knew where Crystal was, but he didn't. He confirmed that Crystal always had E with her, and he became concerned when she was missing and E wasn't with her. He also testified that he had witnessed Crystal accuse Brooks of cheating on her a few weeks prior. However, the defense objected, and the judge ruled to disregard that last statement as it was inadmissible. Prosecutor Shane Young went on to question Riggs, and at one point Riggs said that Crystal was worried about Brooks kicking her out of the house. Next on the stand was Brad Spalding, the Nelson County engineer, who oversaw the landfill and ensured that everything coming in was properly documented. Brooks had listed him on his timeline that he had planned to burn items that had become too expensive to dump at the landfill. However, Brad testified that there were no receipts showing Brooks had been at the landfill. Next, the prosecution called Danny Singleton. He had worked construction for Brooks for 14 years. He testified that he had a conversation with Rosemary Houck before Crystal disappeared, and according to him, Rosemary approached him on a job site one day, and she said she wanted to find someone to get rid of Crystal. He told the jury that he responded, "If you have enough money, you can get it done in Nelson County." Prosecutor Jim Lazowski asked him, "Well, after you talked to Rosemary Houck, what did you do with that information?" Danny responded, "I just kept it to myself." The prosecutor followed up by asking, "Is it the truth that she wanted you to find someone to get rid of Crystal?" "It is the truth." When asked if he was offered a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony, Danny said that never happened. Now, Danny had been called before the Nelson County grand jury in late 2015. At that time, he told them that he had been drinking in Louisville that night that Crystal disappeared. However, on December 16, 2015, he was arrested by the FBI for perjury and was facing up to 20 years in prison. He would later admit that he had actually been smoking crack cocaine in his apartment with a friend that night, and he was just afraid of getting in trouble if he told the truth. While in jail, FBI agents asked Danny if he had thought Rosemary had anything to do with the disappearance, and that's when he first mentioned the alleged hit. On February 5th, 2016, while he was still in jail, facing 20 years and being held on a $300,000 bond. After that conversation with investigators, he agreed to, in which charges were amended down to misdemeanors, and he was released from jail. He testified that he hadn't mentioned the conversation with Rosemary to anyone until after his arrest for perjury in December of 2015. But he insisted that he was telling the truth and that the conversation did happen. Danny also admitted to drinking heavily and using drugs in 2015, obviously, if he was in his apartment smoking crack cocaine. In 2023, he said the Kentucky State Police came to his house and told him that something big was getting ready to happen and that he needed to be on the right side of this case. Danny said that they told him to tell the truth, and that's exactly what he was doing. Following Singleton, the next witness was Chris Lishore, a window tinter. He testified that Brooks came into a shop for tinting after a last-minute cancellation on July 2nd. The tint that Brooks requested was actually illegal. The defense clarified with Chris that he actually called Brooks back with the appointment slot, and on redirect, the Commonwealth pointed out that Brooks returned a few months later and requested the tint to be removed. Then the defense confirmed that Brooks asked to have it removed after being pulled over. Following him, another window tinter was called to testify, stating that Brooks had inquired about services with him as well. And with that, court was adjourned for Thursday, June 26th, day 3 of the trial. And like I said, we'll just go into day 4 for the next video, just so that way it uploads easier. So until the next time, stay safe out there. The world's an ugly place.